Many thanks, my colleague Noah Kipkemboi. Let's now furnish you with the details after Noah has now set the pace for our conversation today. So first of all, let's give you an overall performance of the domestic economy. Economy rebased to 2016. Of course, that revised GDP was estimated to 10.73 trillion Kenya shillings. The economy, of course, as we had said earlier on, contracted by 0.3%. This was mainly due to disruptions in the labor supply. Let's look at some of the sectors that did well. So agriculture sector was up 4.6%, with tea production up 24.1%. Horticultural earnings, on the other side, got us 3.9% to 150.2 billion Kenya shillings. Of course, those are some of the numbers right there from the agricultural sector. Let's give you more on the environment and natural resources, where mineral production went down 5.8% to 22.7 billion Kenya shillings. Forest cover increased to 4.23 million hectares. And of course, the total value of fish landed increased to 26.2 billion Kenya shillings. Let's look at manufacturing sector. So the sector was affected and it reduced by 0.1%. Of course, the value of output was up 2.8% from 2.3 trillion in 2019 to 2.4 trillion. So the total sales by EPZ, that is the Export Promotion Zone, enterprises up 4.3% to 80.5 billion. And then the imports were down 7.5% to 36.8 billion Kenya shillings in 2020. Formal employment in the sector went down 10.3% to 316,900. Of course, this is occasioned by the harsh effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw companies reacting by releasing their employees to the wider market. I'd rather use that polite word without saying sacking. So let's talk about the building and construction sector. Construction sector went up 11.8%, I beg your pardon, with cement consumption going up 21.3% from 6.1 million tons to, get this, 7.4 million tons. The total length of roads under bitumen went up 1.8% to 22,600 kilometers. The wage unemployment went up 33% to 230,500. Let's look at financial sector. We're talking about banking, insurance, the fintech area, and how they performed. So this subsector grew 5.6%, with total domestic credit going up 18.6%. Credit to the national government increased to 1.358%. We're talking about things like T-bills, government bonds, of course, what you and I are contributing towards the construction of the infrastructure by use of those government instruments. Now, let us look at now the private sector, the credit accorded to the private sector. We're talking about corporate bonds, and we've been seeing companies in Kenya giving a lot of corporate bond issuance. So, of course, the private sector loans accorded to them went up by 8.4% to 2.891 trillion Kenya shillings. International trade and balance of payments. The balance of payments went up 152.5 billion Kenya shillings. Exports was up 7.9% to 643.7 billion Kenya shillings. The Kenyan shilling depreciated against major currencies. Of course, that is sources sourced from the Central Bank of Kenya. Let's look at the state of employment and the future of work. So employment declined from 18.1 million to 17.4 million. Private sector jobs went down 10% to 1.857 million. Public sector jobs rose by 19,400. The wage bill declined also from 2,279 billion to 2.197.6 billion Kenya shillings. Let's look at accommodation, tourism, and travel. So tourism earnings went down 43.9% to cash 91.7 billion shillings. This was mainly because of the closures of the airspace and, of course, international arrivals, which went down 71.5%. Hotel bed nights occupancy rate went down 58%. Local conferences, of course, also declined by 87%. I think that was the hugest, the hardest affected subsector of the economy, and 75.2% respectively. Let's look at energy. We're talking about power, we're talking about electricity, which its supply contracted 0.5%, Of course, electricity generated increased by 17.1% to 11.6 million megawatt hours, I beg your pardon. Let's look at the transport and storage and logistics sector. So transport and storage sector went down 7.8%. Total cargo throughput at the port of Mombasa went down 0.9%. Of course, that is occasioned mainly by the COVID-19 pandemic, which now necessitated a lot of borders of being closed down. Newly registered motor vehicles went down 14.2% from 109,751 in 2019 to 94,128 in 2020. Let's now go to one that is close, very, very close to my heart: information technology, innovation, and of course, matters of ICT. Information and communication sector went up, get this, 4.8%. Mobile money transactions went up 20%. To cash 5.2 trillion Kenya shillings. This was mainly facilitated by the fintechs. And of course, we've seen the financial sector taking up a lot of technological innovations and advancement. Commerce transactions went up to 9.4 billion Kenya shillings. Let's now look at health sector, which was badly affected. The national expenditure on health went up 34.5% to 103.1 billion Kenya shillings. County governments up 16% to 106.7 billion Kenya shillings. 60 million cases of diseases reported in health facilities. Of course, hospital beds increased by 9.6%. That there is just an overview of what the economic survey report was looking like this year. Let's now take one more story before we get into the conversation with our resident panelists right here at BizChat Weekly on every Friday on Business Today. Kenya's economy has grown to close to 11 trillion Kenya shillings following the release of the economic survey by the National Treasury and the National Bureau of Statistics. This even as Treasury issued a notice to Parliament in June this year, declaring its intentions to review the debt ceiling from the current 9 trillion Kenya shillings to 12 trillion. Patrick Amimo reports.
The last time Kenya rebased its economy in September 2014, it pushed the country to a low middle income status. This locked Kenya from accessing most concessional loans available to low-income economic countries, but allowed access to more commercial funding through the Eurobond and syndicated loans. The government's huge appetite for loans to fund infrastructural projects has since pushed Kenya's total public debt to 7.7 trillion shillings as at June this year.
The revised nominal GDP was estimated at 10.753 trillion in 2020, from 10.256 trillion in 2019. There's a growth, not marginal, but growth by over 500 billion.
Don't see any evidence that the function of this rebasing was, one, to manipulate economic data, to provide a bigger base for the economy, to allow the government to be able to expand its borrowing.
In June, the government unveiled a 3.6 trillion shillings budget with a budget deficit of 1.2 trillion shillings. Kenya expects to burst through the current debt ceiling of 9 trillion shillings by June 2023. MPs last raised the debt ceiling in 2019 from 6 trillion shillings to the current 9 trillion shillings. This explains the government's new push to review the debt ceiling to 12 trillion shillings.
Through the reforms that we've put in place for the last few months, Kenya Revenue Authority has been performing beyond the target. Every month we collect close to 5 billion above the targets that they are given.
Debt is paid for from revenues. Sure. So what is going to happen, because of this small percentage difference, it's going to show that revenues have to grow by a bigger share to actually match the change in GDP.
The review of GDP comes against the backdrop of the fourth Eurobond offer amounting to 253 billion shillings. The National Treasury plans to borrow a total of 929 billion shillings from local and foreign sources to plug the deficit. It also has an extra 609 billion shillings debt redemption bill for this financial year, which will see it borrow to repay maturing debt.
We want to continue reducing our budget deficit to enable us live within our means.
Gap between public spending and public revenues as shares of GDP is actually larger than we thought before. And what it confirms is a quote-unquote belt tightening that the government of Kenya needs to do in terms of closing the revenue gap.
The level of real GDP for the base year 2016 was revised from 4.3 trillion shillings to 7.6 trillion shillings. In 2019, total GDP was revised by 5.3% from 9.7 trillion shillings to 10.3 trillion shillings. The reviews have been occasioned by enhanced coverage of economic activities in the informal sector. While GDP rebasing is a good economic practice that provides governments with relevant tools for tackling economic challenges, such as growing the economy, fighting poverty and creating jobs. But with poverty, corruption, youth unemployment, insecurity, and gender inequality still entrenched in the economy, Kenyans are here to celebrate their country's elevation to low-middle-income economy. Patrick Amimo, KTN News.
Many thanks, Senior Patrick Amimo. That story right there, rebasing of the economy, will also be part of our discussion with my panelist right here, Ken Gishinga, who is already in our town studio. But then, let's take another story that is now becoming a matter of concern. Pensioners under the National Security Fund. You